Indeed, I think FTT collection is a particularly complex topic, and to a very large extent, obviously, the collection of FTT will be driven by the complexity of the underlying substantive rules, which still are to be set. We have done some work on that topic, albeit based on the current proposal of the directive, and it appears that a number of features of the directive will be very important when considering collection mechanisms and the cost of collection. First of all, I think the geographical scope obviously is very important. Secondly, the nature of the financial instruments covered is important. And also thirdly, and that's quite a broad topic in its own, is the availability of the data required to establish FTT liability. In theory, you could contemplate different collection system, and on one side of the spectrum you have a sort of self-assessment system whereby the broker or the custodian calculates the tax and pays the tax over to the relevant tax authorities. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have collective collection mechanisms. And collective collection can be organized in various ways. You can have a system with a limited functionality comparable to CREST, for example, the SDRT collection system operated by CREST, which basically contains a limited tax technical logic and actually requires the users to input a flag that indicates the FTT treatment of the transaction. You could also think about a more ambitious collection system, a system that actually would contain a full FTT logic and would actually be collecting all the data required to make FTT determinations. So it's clear that when you're dealing with a complex rule set, that the number of data required will be substantial and will not necessarily be readily available. So whatever the system is chosen, it needs to be able to do a certain number of things. One obviously is to determine FTT liability, and FTT liability, the determination exercise will be difficult to the extent that the rules would not be entirely clear. So having clear rules and rules that are of a nature that can be programmed into an automated system will be very important in that respect. Second, obviously, is the collection and the remittance of the tax, which means that you're basically restricted to a model whereby some access to cash exists. So be it the first intermediary or be it a collection system such as a CSD that has access to cash account, that's what is strictly required. Because the way the market works is such that there will not always be a cash flow available that can be used to deduct the tax from. Another big challenge obviously will be enforceability and audit. Given in particular the geographical scope and the nature of the instrument involved, it means that the system should be made to work for a large variety of countries, a large number of countries, also countries established not part of the FTT zone and not even part of the European Union. Also, the tax is obviously intended to apply at this moment, at least to intergroup transactions, to transactions taking place on less regulated markets. So it will be a challenge to ensure that those transactions can be covered. So if a CSD, for example, would be appointed as a collecting agent, we would have to find a way to ensure wide access to that system, even for those entities that would not ordinarily use that system for settlement purposes. And also the system would have to have features such that it can be used for FTT collection only. So the CREST system, for example, they have developed recently a stamped assessed transaction model, which means that you can pay SDRT to trust even in respect of a transaction that is not settled through the UK CSD. And all of that, obviously, cost is very important. So cost is very important, and there again, we basically come back to the other objective. If the rules are very complex, it's going to be very difficult to avoid the cost. And obviously, there is the question of potential reuse of existing infrastructure, CSDs, ICSDs, CCPs, stock exchanges, or regulatory requirements such as EMIR or MiFID and others. And it's true, I think, to some extent, this is going to reduce the cost. But again, depending on the scope, the objective scope of the directive, this will contribute to the cost reduction or not. So it's very important, I think, that when the scope is considered, that collection is also, assessed upfront, because the cost may vary considerably depending on the type of instrument. So the next few slides I'm not going to discuss in detail. I think they show sort of what is to be included in the collection functionality. And when you compare various models from self-assessment to expanded centralized models, you will see that it actually entails a shift of tasks that would be reserved typically for tax authorities to the financial sector, either by the collecting agent or to the banks that are using the system. So it's important to realize that shift and the cost of that for financial institutions. So in the end, I think when you would have to pick one system that seems most adequate for collection, you'll see that when you look deeper into the topic, that in the end there is not such a big difference between self-assessment and a centralized collection model with limited functionality. Because in the end, when the central system relies on brokers and custodians to flag the transactions, the validation of those instructions that can be applied by the collection agent will be very limited, because in the end it doesn't have all of the data required to assess and verify and confirm these inputs. And the choice between limited and expanded functionality, that's also, a difficult question, because sometimes, financial institutions tell us, we would prefer to have a system which contains all of the rules, because they're concerned that, if the rules are not clear, as was the case, I think, in certain countries that introduced FTT, the financial industry is in a very difficult spot, because they want to be compliant, but they don't know how to be compliant. And therefore, they believe if you have a common logic introduced into a system, at least you can be sure that you've done the right thing and that there is a common interpretation of the rules. So I have to speed up. I've been given 5 minutes only on this complex topics, but I think just to lead you through a few other questions, I think, and there are many more. One other question, obviously, that can be raised is when we talk about central collection, who's to operate that collection system? And obviously we're getting into a difficult space, because there is an infrastructural piece of the market which is also occupied by commercially organizations that compete with each other. So adopting a single collection mechanism for the EU FTT and, for example, designating CSDs, that will make global custodians unhappy, probably, because they will say that they can also perfectly handle FTT collection if necessary. So we have to avoid creating monopolies, and there is, I think, already been a decision of the European Court of Justice on the SDRT clearing service charge, which actually is a rule that applies under the SDRT regimes, and that involves the payment of 3 times the standard rate of tax when securities are transferred from the local CSD into another CSD. So very clearly, I think when a system is chosen, also those issues will need to be observed to avoid that the designation of a collecting agent would create discriminations. And again, apart from that, I think there's this whole debate about whether actually what to do with transactions that are not being done within the territory of the FTT of the participating member states, or that are done on markets that are less regulated. And very clearly, I think there's various ways of dealing with that, but to some extent it's going to remain a political discussion to see whether foreign countries are willing to cooperate in the enforcement of the tax. Otherwise, at least the functionality will have to be set such that it is accessible at least to financial institutions that are not resident in any of the participating member states. And also the functionality will have to be developed such that it is not limited to security classes that are accepted in those infrastructures for other purposes like clearing and settlement.